Hello and welcome to this episode of the Geoeconomic Agenda, a podcast from the Institute of Geoeconomics at the Asia-Pacific Initiative in Tokyo that investigates the connections between economics, politics, business, and society. I'm your host, Paul Nadeau, and I'm a visiting researcher here at the IOG. Today we're sitting down with friend of the podcast, Dr. Stephen Nagy, professor at International Christian University in Tokyo. We're going to discuss Canada's perspectives on the U.S. election. Dr. Nagy, thanks for joining us.
Great to be here, Paul. Thanks.
So, obviously, Canada and the United States have a very close relationship. It's the world's longest demilitarized border. There's $3 billion worth of trade crossing the border each day, 400,000 people. I used to be one of those people very frequently. So the connections between the two countries are obviously huge. And while Canadians, I know, will bristle at the idea that the U.S. election is going to have an impact on what happens in Canada, Canada is exposed to these kinds of things. So just generally speaking, what is Canada's broad perspective on what they're seeing south of the border?
So I don't think there's one voice in how Canadians are thinking about the U.S. politics. On the one hand, I think there's some people that are they admire the MAGA movement. They look at Mr. Trump as somewhat refreshing in his authenticity and his willingness to push back against some issues. They see him standing up for migration and industrial policy and increasing wages as something that maybe that's where Canada should be going. And then others, on left of center are looking at him as a complete opposite, like anti-immigrants, that's someone that will fundamentally have negative consequences for Canada, and they're rooting for Kamala Harris. So I really think there's a lot of diversity in views about these two candidates, and our politicians and our businesses are looking south and they're saying, how can we stabilize this relationship? How can we benefit from either? And how can we position ourselves in a way that we profit from whoever becomes the next president of the United States? And others, and this is a very frank assessment, don't think there's much difference between the two candidates. And, Mr. Trump is seen as a shit sandwich, pardon my French, and Kamala Harris is seen as a shit sandwich with cheese. The reality is there's not much different, and she'll make the same demands on the Canadian economy and Canadian politicians. It'll just taste better. And this is an unfortunate reality, but I think that this is what many analysts like myself think about and understand when we're looking at these two candidates.
So what is the sandwich that we're looking at here? Because ostensibly Donald Trump's international economic proposals, seem on the surface pretty dramatic, the kinds of things that he's been suggesting and whatnot. And when you've got as deep a relationship economically as the United States and Canada, presumably there would be a big difference between a bunch of tariffs versus maybe not so many tariffs. So is the maybe not the cheese on the turd sandwich, or is there something else? Let me put it this way. Are Canadians skeptical that Trump's big, dramatic, all tariffs all the time approach is actually going to happen?
I think most believe that the tariffs are going to happen. I think that as we look at U.S. policy, I think it's unhelpful just to look at it through the lens of Mr. Trump. Mr. Biden actually continued most of the tariffs that the Trump administration put forward on China, and in general, it's seen as the renegotiation of USMCA agreement will be prejudicial to Canada and Mexico moving forward. And it's seen over the long term is that the United States has made a decision that to compete with China, it must have industrial champions. It must concentrate and rebuild the middle class. It must increase the wages and must strengthen its economy. And in order to do that, it's going to pressure allies, friends, and frenemies to shift their economic policies in a way that are more synergistic with the United States. And in this sense, if Mr. Trump is elected, I see continuity and perhaps doubling down on Mr. Biden's policies. And I think, again, if Ms. Harris is elected, we will see her as well continue with these industrial policies and trying to build those higher fences and smaller yards and create an industrial sector that can compete and outcompete the Chinese market. And I think this is the big long-term picture, and that we're not going to be shifting from this over the next 5 or 10 years. Rather, we're seeing a global economy balkanize into a Chinese part of the world, probably a European part of the world, a North American part of the world. And industrial policy is the new lingua franca of trade, rather than those free trade agreements. And in that sense, Harris's trade policy will likely be a turd sandwich with a little bit more cheese, as you voiced quite
Canadian-made cheese?
Probably not. That's, again, we're going to see a championing of U.S. businesses understanding that a strong, robust U.S. economy is the best way to compete with authoritarian states like China.
So then what does Canada do in that kind of situation? I mean, Canada's a strong economy. It's G7, but it's not nearly as big as that of the United States. It's not as big as China. So does Canada try to do what Japan did in the first Trump administration, which is try to carry the flame of internationalization? Does it try to do its own industrial policy? Is it a little from column A, a little from column B? What do they do?
I think it's a layered approach. So Canada should continue to champion the CPTPP and work with partners like Japan to enlarge the agreement and try to get more partners so it becomes a critical mass of countries that are participating in a 21st century agreement that protects intellectual property rights, champions labor and environmental policies, and tries to limit the role of state-owned enterprises. So that's one part of the formula. Another part of the formula is through the renegotiation of the NAFTA 2.0, finding out where Canada's comparative advantages are and try to protect those comparative advantages. I think there's some real wisdom in trying to think about how they can help the United States with some of its industrial policy and its approach to competing with China economically and technologically by getting on board. And this is not just an economic policy. If we're thinking about agreements such as AUKUS, well, Canada can participate in Pillar 2 in terms of the AI and quantum computing and add value in that area. I didn't say join AUKUS, I said plug in.
Okay.
So I think these are ways to, again, work with the United States, help the United States succeed, demonstrate Canada as a key partner, and by doing that, you're demonstrating to Americans and stakeholders within the American political system that Canada is credible and that prejudicing or alienating Canada by putting tariffs on Canada is not in the interest of the United States. And in that sense, I think Canada's going to have to work hard. It's going to have to learn from partners that, like Japan, that have been negotiated with the Trump administration and America's changing views of the global economy. And they've negotiated it quite well. And I think that there's room to work with these like-minded countries to try and work with the United States in more productive and synergistic ways.
So looking back a little bit, one of the things you always frequently hear from our counterparts in Japan is that they believe that they handled the Donald Trump administration pretty successfully, that they considered that to be a relative win for Japan. And so they look forward to the possibility of another Trump administration with a degree of confidence. How does Canada look back on that experience? Do they feel a similar confidence? Do they look back on lessons learned? And sidebar, this might be the point to mention that Canada might have a new government of its own sometime early next year. So how does that come into play?
So I think that at the leadership level, the former president of the United States, Donald Trump, and Prime Minister Trudeau didn't have chemistry, to say the least. And this created real challenges for the bilateral relationship. But after a bit of reflection, what we saw is our provincial leaders and business leaders avoid the leadership level of communication and just directly engage with the states, directly engage with U.S. business groups, directly engage with stakeholders that would eventually influence the Trump administration's policies. That is the better approach. And once that was the approach that was taken, what we saw is the bilateral relations stabilized. And that we went back to that happy place between Canada and the United States. And I think that in part, Canada was trying to leverage its traditional strengths and strong cross-border relations with states and labor unions and businesses in the United States to build better relations. But again, I think initially the leadership level was a huge problem. A change in leader in Canada, I don't think it'll change much either. And the simple reason is that, again, the US's industrial policy is not targeting Canada, it's targeting China.
Right.
How to outcompete China at the economic and technological level, tire it out, and eventually see China go the way of the Soviet Union in many ways. And that means building that industrial and technological base that can outcompete China. And that requires, unfortunately, pressuring our allies to jump on board and get with the program in order to accomplish that goal. So I think it's going to be hard. It's going to force Canadian businesses to make tough choices, be more productive, open up markets. But there's opportunities. And I think, again, Canada should think about its comparative advantage, such as energy security, critical mineral security, leverage these pillars to build credibility with the United States and allies to say, yeah, we have a real place in the competition with China. And we can use our comparative advantages to help you outcompete authoritarian states like China.
So what about specific points of friction? We've talked about industrial policy and just general American outlooks on how international economies are supposed to work nowadays. As deep and as long-lasting the economic relationship has been between the two countries, there are significant points of friction. I know, I used to work on some of these when I was a Senate staffer, stuff like softwood lumber, like dairy access, beef, anything like that you expect to come down the pipeline. And when USMCA, for example, comes up for renegotiation in 2026?
Yeah,
something like that. Okay. Yeah. What are going to be the main points of contention? What's going to get the diplomats and the lawyers locking horns?
I assume that one of the key areas will be the percentage of made in America. And this was renegotiated under the NAFTA 2.0 to increase the amount of, or the percentage of goods actually made in the United States. And when we think about North America's trade agreement and we think about something like a car, the car actually is assembled in a plant somewhere in some part of the United States, but all the parts are moving constantly between Mexico, Canada, and the United States, sometimes several times. So how do you map what is actually made in the United States? It's going to be increasingly a challenge. And I think the percentage right now is 60% or 70% must be made in the United States.
Something like that, yeah.
I don't remember the number.
Fact check later, but yeah.
But my view is they're probably going to try to increase how much is made in the United States with this, as Jake Sullivan talks about, a foreign policy for the middle class. So to increase the representation of made in America. So those profits go to ordinary American citizens. So Canada's going to, and Mexico are both going to be faced with this challenge of, how do they agree to this made in America approach? On agricultural products, it's an issue. Lumber will continue to be an issue. Energy will be an issue. These will all continue to be an issue as I think the United States, whoever's in power, are going to try and champion that middle class and strengthen the middle class's wages, employment security, and this idea of making the United States much more autonomous from authoritarian actors that are now, the center of global production. I think it's, from looking at the United States approach, I think they can move it in a better direction, but the reality is, I don't know how much made in America is going to actually help them deleverage from the Chinese market. I think last year there was about $700 million or $750 billion dollars in bilateral trade between the two countries, and that means Americans are buying stuff made in China, and it continues to increase despite the tariffs, despite the tensions. So how much can they really deleverage from the Chinese market? And I just don't think, no matter how much the United States transforms their industrial policy to support made in America, they're not going to be able to replace China over the next 10 or 15 or 20 years.
Of course, yeah.
And that means replacing it by producing in the United States, but also finding an alternative production network. Southeast Asia is not there,
Yeah.
and it won't be able to replace China because of its size. It's a heterogeneous population. They don't have the infrastructure. India is a different story. They also will not be able to replace China. So if you're talking about decoupling, where do you decouple to?
Right.
And there's no place to decouple to.
Exactly.
And
there's a reason why so many supply chains ended up in China in the first place.
That's right. So as the United States moves forward on their industrial policy, and again, as they renegotiate trade agreements with Canada and Mexico, the pressure points are rather limited because there's the areas that the United States actually can't decouple from.
Right.
And there's the areas that they can focus on, which is generally agricultural products. And that ratio of how much is made in America. And that may be painful for Canada, but I think there's ways to redefine what made in North America means and to distribute some of the benefits of these renegotiations.
This might be an odd question, but I'll work through it.
Sure.
Where's Canada's heart in all of this? By which I mean, what's their ideal international economic policy? And the reason I ask is because we saw Abe Shinzo, I think, work this out pretty successfully when he was in power during the first Trump administration, where he played golf with Trump, he did the hamburgers, he did all that stuff.
The sumo tournament.
The sumo tournament. But he also, almost immediately, Abe this is, almost immediately resurrected the trade agreement, CPTPP, that Trump kicked in the dustbin on day one. So Abe was pretty successful at managing the United States while still, getting a little bit closer to Japan's idealized international foreign policy. We've talked a lot about how Canada is going to be exposed to, risks and opportunities from the US election. But what's Canada's just bigger goal? What's their ideal international economic policy look like? Or are they just at the whims of the United States and China?
I still don't think they've come to the understanding that our international economy and globalization is fundamentally transforming as U.S.-China relationship becomes increasingly competitive. I still think they're wedded to the idea of free trade and expanding free trade agreements. As a result, I don't think they're positioning themselves in the way that they could. And this is a bit of a challenge.
Just sidebar, would this hypothetically change under a new Canadian government?
I don't think so. I just don't think they're understanding the currents of international affairs and how we're in a period of fundamental change in terms of how the global economy works. It's always useful to compare Japan and Canada when we're talking about the U.S. relationship. Canada has about 90% of its trade cross-border, so it has a tremendously beneficial relationship. With China, I think maybe it's 4% of its GDP, and Japan and South Korea maybe make up 3 or 4% in Europe. So as Canada is thinking about change and we're thinking about the global economy, its destiny is wedded to the U.S. And it must have strong engagement policies with the United States. And when you contrast this with Japan, Japan has 20,000 small and medium-sized enterprises in China. Last year, the trade relationship was something like $380 billion, despite the territorial issues, despite the military drills around Taiwan, on and on and on. And Japan has continued to try and straddle and find ways to moderate U.S.-China competition by, one, strengthening the bilateral alliance, two, having a non-zero-sum approach with China by engaging with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, at least considering its application for the CPTPP, but at the same time talking a lot about economic security and resilience and investing in alternative supply chains so that it's much more resilient against economic coercion. So these two states are fundamentally in different positions. And as a result, their choices vis-a-vis the United States are different. Japan only has one ally. That's the United States. But that's not changing. There's lots of minilateral partnerships, and it's a leader on trade. But it's really created, as Akiko Fukushima from Aoyama University talks about, a lattice work or a lasagna-based approach to its security. Lasagna is always more delicious than lattice, right?
Yeah, I'm going to start picking up the lasagna-based approach.
But it has the US-based alliance, and then it has the Quad, and then it has minilateral partnerships, and then it has the CTPPP or RCEP, Japan-EU Infrastructure Connectivity Agreement. It has reciprocal access agreements with the UK, the Philippines, and Australia. So it has this lasagna-based approach to securing itself. Where Canada it's a one-hit wonder, and that's with the United States. So as it's negotiating these changes, it's going to need to fundamentally, read the tea leaves in the United States to understand that trade is never going back to the 1990s or 2000s. We've moved into an era of, again, balkanization of trade, industrial policies, and the United States competing directly with Chinese national champions for global dominance. And we're not there yet in Canada.
What do you think it would take to get Canada there? You've already ruled out a change of government.
Yeah,
let me back up. You've already ruled out the possibility that a change in government would initiate that kind of change. Is that fair?
Probably a domestic economic shock that affects Canadians, and then politicians translate this into understanding that they have to change their economic policies. And we're not there yet. The Canadian economy is really, it's also balkanized, right? You have, Ontario and Quebec really integrated into northeastern United States, lots of cross-border trade. British Columbia is pretty much an Asian economy. The Alberta provinces, they work on the east coast of the United States. So this balkanization, even in Canada, suggests that there's a lot of different approaches. Lots of discussions that I've had recently were more about talking about a sub-regional approach. So the prairie provinces with their agricultural products, their critical energy minerals, or energy and critical minerals, could find sub-regional approaches to engaging in the region and the United States that move themselves away from Ottawa. And I think that this may be the way we move forward in terms of Canadian economic policy. Rather than a national approach, it's going to be a sub-regional approach because Ottawa's national policies aren't working for the country in the way that we would like it to.
Okay, last question. I've been asking everyone this. You want to make a prediction on what happens November 5th?
We're likely not going to know the results on November 5th.
No, that's the right answer, probably.
It's probably the right answer. I think that we're going to see court cases. We're going to see claims that there was illegal voting. And unless there is an overwhelming victory by one side or the other, I think that the election is going to be, we're going to see, both sides argue that they won the election, which means instability in the United States. For Canada, either candidate is going to be a challenge. I do think for countries like Japan, and we're talking here in Japan, I think for Japan, they actually will do well, whoever's in the White House. If Mr. Trump is elected, many countries will dump a lot of money into the United States to curry favor with Mr. Trump. And Mr. Trump, I think, does understand the value of Japan in competing with China. If Ms. Harris wins, countries will dump a lot of money in the United States and celebrate that the system works and this is the end of the magma movement, maybe, and that the U.S. economy will boom. So in either case, I think for Japan, the U.S. will come out stronger, and that Japan will be in a better position because its allies' economy will be in a good position. But Japan is probably one of the few countries that's going to benefit from the next administration. I do think there's going to be some real losers. South Korea will be challenged by whoever's in the White House. Germany will be challenged by whoever's in the White House. Canada will be challenged by whoever's in the White House. And we should start preparing last year for these kinds of really, I think, destabilizing changes in the U.S. politics.
Dr. Stephen Nagy, thank you as always.
Thank you.
This is the GeoEconomics Agenda with Paul Nadeau. Vikings are known for a lot of things: longships, Valhalla, sagas, and lots more, but they should also be recognized for helping establish one of the world's first truly global trade networks, with routes connecting the continents of Europe, Africa, Asia, and North America. Most people might be aware that the Viking settlement at Paul in Newfoundland, or at least understand that the Vikings reached North America. But there's also evidence of commerce as well. That seems to be the strong implication of a Norse coin found in a Native American midden heap, or garbage pile, on Penobscot Bay in Maine. Midden heaps are great sources for learning about the diets and habits of past societies, and in this case, a coin made in Norway seemed to make its way into the pile. The coin was confirmed as having a Viking origin and was probably made sometime between 1065 and 1080 AD, and coincides with the time of the Norse settlements in nearby Greenland. There are two possibilities for how the coin traveled from Viking-age Norway to the Native Americans of the coast of Maine. The first is that Viking expeditions from Greenland made their way down all the way to the Gulf of Maine, and that there was some kind of direct exchange between the Vikings and the Native Americans. Given what we know about Native American boat building, it's unlikely they would have constructed boats capable of reaching Greenland and returning home with goods to trade, making a Maine-based encounter more likely. The second possibility is that the Penobscot Bay site was a node or a hub in a much larger trade network stretching across northeastern North America, and the penny made its way to Maine through trade routes extending to places on the continent where we know Vikings settled, like modern Newfoundland or Labrador. We don't know much more beyond that. It was the only coin found on the site, and so far the only Norse artifact confirmed in North America. The coin seems to have been used as a pendant and was ultimately discarded or misplaced in the garbage heap about 200 years after the last Viking trip to North America. But for a story with so few details, the implication is clear: that the network of Viking trade stretched from the coast of Maine to the Caspian Sea and beyond to China, and reaching 4 continents, something that had never been done to that point and wouldn't happen again until the European conquest of the Americas about 500 years later. That's all for this episode, but stay tuned for more on the way. Until then, we want to talk about what you want to hear about, as well as take your questions for our show, so send us an email at geoeconomicagenda@ihj.global. Be sure to like, rate, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, tell your friends, and most of all, keep listening. Thanks for joining us, thanks to the team at API for making this happen, and we'll talk to you next time.